to the New Leadership for Society webinar series, Reimagining Work Post-COVID. I'm Brian Lowry, and I'm here to have conversations with leaders in the area of work across all sorts of domains, focused on how we might change work or think differently about work in the post-COVID world. The series is 10 sessions long, and we'll focus on how things are currently organized and imagine new possibilities. Our goal is to present and challenge ways of thinking about a world drastically changed by COVID. To do this, we'll talk to people like my guest today. We'll use the same Zoom room every session, and we'll send it out an hour before the session starts. We'll also send out weekly reminders so you won't miss any of our sessions. And thanks for being here for the first one. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. It's Aquilina Soriano Versoza. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm the executive director of the Filipino Workers Center, and I'm also the board president of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. I've actually been the director of Filipino Workers Center for over 20 years now, as we got started organizing primarily Filipino caregivers, those who work one-on-one in private homes, and then also caregivers who are working in small facilities like boarding care facilities where they're caring for maybe like 6 to 10 individuals at a time, and really trying to transform how the work that they do is seen, like how it's valued, how it's compensated, and just transforming the industry itself. So I'm really excited to be here. COVID has been such an intense time period where we've felt in our community the impacts so much loss, so much crisis, and at the same time, so much opportunity to connect, so much opportunity to actually think and reimagine things, the world, how, so much was blown out of the water in terms of like, what is normal? What is life? What is the normal? So we really are taking this time to think about, normal before was not so good necessarily for us. So how can we change things moving forward?
Yeah, I can imagine that for the people that you represent in particular, COVID had to be a really harrowing time in a lot of ways. So I'd love to hear what's the current state of kind of the marketplace for low wage workers. I assume that the people you represent don't get paid as much as many others in the healthcare industry, but maybe that's not right. So what is the current situation in the marketplace?
Mm-hmm. Well, with caregivers, with home care workers, the standard across the industry, many are getting less than minimum wage, especially with immigrant workers who are working in the private side of the industry. Often they're not paid overtime. We have many who are working live-in situations 24 hours a day, getting paid a lump sum per day, which often equals to something like $3 to $5 a day with no, or per hour with no overtime, and no benefits, no job security, no health care. So this has been kind of the norm. And as we've been trying to shift it to really value the work that they're doing and lift standards, we have been making some shifts, but during COVID, a lot of that went backwards. Even in small facilities, we see people working for as low as, like, we have a case where people are being paid $2.50 an hour, no overtime, in very, very intense work, working around the clock. But I'm also part of the LA Workers Center network. And so just seeing the wages, our wage theft is kind of one of our central issues. And so in the restaurant industry, in the garment industry, in the warehouse industry, grocery stores, we just see that just even meeting basic minimum wage standards over time is still a struggle for a lot of low wage workers.
Yeah, and Aki, can you give us a sketch of what your constituents look like? So you already mentioned that a lot of them are immigrants, but
Mm-hmm.
what does the average person that's in the industry look like, or what's their situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's actually quite a diversity in the industry itself, but a majority are women of color doing work in the domestic worker industry, nanny, childcare in terms of nannies, caregivers doing home care with those who have disabilities or with elders, and then house cleaning. In home care, though, we do have a significant number of men, and primarily men of color, immigrant men who are also in this field because there is like amounts of lifting and things like that that are needed. So we have a significant number of men doing this work. There are a large number of undocumented workers who are supporting this work as a part of the workforce. Um, Although many of them have been here for a long time. So there are also a lot of new immigrants, but a majority of the workforce would be immigrants who have been here over 10 years. Many are undocumented, but even if they have documentation in the immigrant community, the Filipino immigrant community that we see, many of them are still not receiving the full wages that they should be getting.
And so I guess I'm wondering, as you think about the breadth of the people who are using it, why does this like tell me why I'm not using home care, for example, right now. You know, I thankfully don't need that at the moment, but why should someone like me or people who aren't using it, why should we be, tell me why we should be concerned about this segment of the workforce?
Mm-hmm. Well, care is a issue that touches everyone. Well, first of all, right now, the baby boomers have been coming into retirement age. So there is this demographic shift overall in our society. And every 8 seconds, someone's turned 65 in our society. So the needs, so this means because our senior population is growing exponentially, then our need for care is also growing exponentially. And many of us who are, similar ages, maybe me and you, are also a part of a sandwich generation where you're caring for those in your family, maybe parents or grandparents, or elders in the family, as well as needing childcare. And so that's really, and we don't, that's the sandwich generation, or sometimes called the panini generation, in terms of how squeezed we are trying to work, but also trying to provide so much care without a lot of assistance from society to provide this care.
Yeah, and I guess, do you expect this? I assume you expect the needs to increase. Is that right? Is that what I understand about what you're saying in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
aging of the population?
Mm-hmm. Well, so needs are already growing exponentially in terms of our society. So if we all want accessibility to like a good quality of life as we age, I mean, it really is an issue of, do we all have the chance and opportunity to choose if we want to age in and amongst our own community? And it's also a basic human right for people with disabilities to be able to have that kind of support to really be in and thriving in their own communities. And having actually this multi-generational communities where we have our elders, in and amongst us, that actually enriches all of our lives. So people are also living longer than ever. So it could be a real crisis if we aren't preparing and aren't providing support for that. But it's also this amazing opportunity that we as a society could actually, really benefit from all of the experience and everything that seniors and a multi-generational kind of community can provide. So this is about quality of life for all of us, actually, having support for care, basic care of both elders as well as childcare. So we actually at NDWA and Caring Cross Generations, our big vision is universal family care. You know, other countries actually do this that provide access to both childcare and long-term care at home for seniors and people with disabilities. And so this is something that we really dream of to support our families. And that's like absolutely a women's issue. If we want women to be able to thrive and be really successful in our society, we need to provide universal care.
Yeah, I hope it's also an issue for men, because I would hope that they're in the position of also, increasing the amount of care they provide for children and their older relatives and friends as well. But I hear you. I hear you. So
absolutely, more and more men are providing that care, but still until now, majority of those who are stepping in to do care, to play care roles are women. And so like retirement, that becomes a big issue in retirement. If you had to pull yourself out of the workforce, you actually don't have retirement then when you need it, even though you've actually been providing so much, of your care labor, that makes everything still function. Child care, elder care is one of the top reasons that employees are having to be absent from work also, men and women, actually. So it is an issue that cuts across the board. And I'm so happy that men are stepping in more to play care roles. But if we're thinking about equity also, this is definitely a women's issue, that if we want women to have equity in the workplace, we absolutely have to have universal family care.
No, I completely agree. I'm imagining and hoping for a future that is more equitable, where everyone is sharing more broadly in these, the kind of burdens that we all should be as a society taking on, I think. So I'm curious about how the pandemic affected your constituents, because you mentioned childcare, and it's been a lot in the news about how teachers or other people that help with childcare have been affected by the pandemic and the pressures they faced. So I'm curious how the pandemic has affected the people that you represent.
Mm-hmm. Well, childcare providers like nannies, when COVID first hit, suddenly they were unemployed, absolutely. And because a lot of them are employed, directly hired, suddenly they were without income. So that was a huge economic crisis. And of course, it was a crisis for, also then the families that don't have that care anymore, working from home. But it was suddenly an economic crisis, especially if you're an undocumented immigrant. You don't have access to the same type of relief and programs that others do. So unemployment insurance, while here in California, there was the pandemic unemployment insurance, so that even if you're a gig worker, right? If you were self-employed, you could access it. But if you were undocumented, you couldn't access any of that. So that was an immediate crisis. For home care workers, it was a bit different, because there's no way to stop the home care, stop the need for home care. There's no way to zoom in doing home care where you're providing assistance for activities of daily living, helping people to eat and to just to live on a daily basis. So in facilities, what we saw was when COVID, when the shutdowns happened, if you were inside the facility, you're suddenly working 24 hours no matter what, and you're kind of quarantining together in there. So that is super intense work. And so you almost get they got no kind of break. Plus, it was so uncertain in terms of, as always, we were finding so much about COVID itself. How it spread, the best practices for protecting and stopping the spread, that in these facilities, because they aren't necessarily like hospitals or really health care facilities, a lot of them kind of fell through the cracks in terms of what should the protocols be. And there was a huge epidemic of, outbreaks of COVID and so many deaths in long-term care facilities, both clients, the individuals, the seniors, as well as workers. We lost way too many people in our own membership. But also, also for those working in individual homes, there was no guidance at all. So for some folks, they ended up having to, like if they work for multiple families, choosing one family to work for. So they may just work for one family, and so they lost half of their income. And then they had additional costs in terms of transportation, not wanting to take public transportation that would expose them so much, or others also quarantined with their clients, which has its own kind of advantages, but also it's disadvantages as well. Often it was not more pay, but just being there longer and doing more work because the families couldn't necessarily afford it. So it was just a crisis. Getting PPEs was very difficult. At the beginning, we had a bunch of people who were exposed to COVID, but it was really hard to get testing. And if you're undocumented or even immigrant, a lot of our caregivers are older actually in age, who are filling this role. So not as immigrants, older, and those who are undocumented, a lot of them don't actually drive. So the very first testing facilities for a while were drive-through only. So this made it really hard for them to actually get testing. And then if they did need to quarantine, it made it really, really hard because a lot of them lived in really crowded housing. So, there's one house of our members where it's like 16 people living in one house. So if someone is exposed, and they're all working with seniors, there's almost all caregivers in this house, you can just imagine how vulnerable it makes the whole household, as well as their clients. So it was just very, very tough. It definitely had a disproportionate impact in the Filipino community, both caregivers, but also healthcare workers, a lot of essential workers in our community that continued, to work in grocery stores or, also other places as well. So, and then we have intergenerational homes and a lot of overcrowding. So, so we just saw a lot of deaths and a lot of infections.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic and to that. It had to be really tough when it first came through, especially for the kind of people that you represent and people in your community. The healthcare workers and elder care and child caregivers were clearly at heightened risk early on, and still today probably. And so I'm curious about the unemployment insurance. You mentioned that, so not a lot of people were, I guess, eligible because of their circumstances, but the people that were, did that affect their interest in work? Because there's been a lot of conversation about, is there been too much unemployment insurance? Is it preventing people from wanting to work? And so I'm curious if that has been something you've noted in your community. How has unemployment insurance affected how people's attitudes toward the work they were doing?
Mm-hmm. Overall, we didn't see a big change that folks were, well, some was because they weren't eligible for it. So, but some people took themselves out of the workforce anyways, just for fear of really for their own health. Even if they weren't receiving unemployment, those are really hard decisions. I think it's a real, I just think it's just the wrong framework. Like, people weren't interested to work because of unemployment. I think it's just that, the wages were too low. And I think what unemployment insurance did was gave workers actually back a little bit of power for them to be able to assess, and think about which jobs would be best for them. So I don't think for us, we didn't see a change so much, but I really think, especially in the industries where I think the wages were just pushed lower and lower because workers had little choices. Unemployment actually, I think, made the market forces work more fairly. and maybe how they should, where workers, are able to opt out if the wages are not good enough. And for many of those industries, especially restaurants, those wages are not sufficient.
Got it. So I have a question about the way you set up your organization. Why organize along lines of ethnic identity? So there's, by the way, a long history, as I'm sure you know, of racism, both in just a general workplace, obviously, but also within unions. That's a longstanding issue in unions historically, has been keeping out certain groups. So I'm curious, why decide to organize along ethnic lines as opposed to focusing just on industry?
Well, really, it's because we saw that multi-racial spaces were not super effective at organizing our community, and that there needed to be a safe, focused organizing effort that is really language specific, cultural specific, to be able to really be effective in organizing. And that from there, then we're actually able to engage and then build together with multiracial coalitions. So we are very much in many different multiracial coalition spaces, from the National Domestic Worker Alliance to the LA Worker Center Network. And it's really because our folks would not, there may be a few, that will come into multiracial spaces, but many, majority would not, and that there needed to be the kind of cultural and language proficiency and cultural specific strategies in terms of organizing that could really effectively reach a broad number of Filipino workers. And so we're just trying to shift actually a lot of culture, a lot of narratives within the Filipino community that helps build an environment for it to be worker friendly, to debunk a lot of myths that people learn, because we were a direct colony of the United States. And so what we learn in school in the Philippines is through the eyes of the curriculum that America put together for us. And so when we come over here, there's also, many different myths. And so it really needs a kind of, strategy where people feel comfortable to be able to explore all these things and feel a part of something. Because it's just really difficult to organize, especially we're in an industry where they're scattered all over the place, around in individual homes. So first, we're also dealing with an industry that's difficult to organize in the first place. And one way that we've been able to be effective is actually to be community specific, because there's a lot of work, just unity to be built in that community, so that we can also bring people along on, issues of democracy, issues of housing, issues of voting rights, and really make that shift. And issues of unionization also. They're very vilified in the Philippines. So that's what we found to be effective.
I'm happy you brought up the issue of unionization. So I think there's concerns about unions, and not obviously, I didn't realize in the Philippines, but certainly in the United States. And so I'm curious, how do you respond to someone that says unions limit the ability of business to create opportunities, right? That in some sense, unions might exacerbate inequities because they limit the ability to expand markets or expand what's possible. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, first of all, I think I would respond that, first of all, it's not true that unions actually limit business opportunities. It actually creates more of a balance in our society, because workers need to earn enough to be a part of a strong economy. It actually builds overall a strong economy. And with workers having more of a voice in businesses, it actually can make businesses stronger as well. I mean, just I guess thinking about like if we think about how Toyota, took the viewpoint that, anytime a worker should have, a voice, say if something's wrong, they can say something, that actually made them more effective. If we think about that unions are giving space actually to workers to have a voice in the business, it actually can make the business stronger, because we're in a capitalist society, and owners and shareholders are going to tend to try and extract as much profit as they can out of the businesses. And if there is no balance to that, that is like a cancer in our society, where there's overgrowth of wealth inequalities. And so we need a strong union base of workers, and we need that more now. And we need workers organized and having voices in all different ways, in their work sites. Right now, domestic workers aren't able to unionize overall because of exclusions in the Federal Standards Labor Act. So we need workers organized in many different places, but we need worker power to be able to build a stronger economy. We need worker voice to make sure that, businesses become more green, also that they're caring about the climate, that they're caring about the sustainability of workers and their families. Because in the end, if workers are completely impoverished, that also hurts our economy.
Right. So when you talked about the federal acts that excluded domestic workers, I assume you're talking about the National Labor Relations Act that excluded agricultural and domestic workers. Is that what you're?
That's correct. Yeah. Well, there's several. So there's the NLRB, there's the FSLA. These are all of the basic laws in the 1930s, right, that established a lot of the rights that workers enjoy today. And as you said, agricultural workers and domestic workers were excluded back in the 1930s, and not for any good reason, but actually just to maintain the racial and economic hierarchy in the South, because that's where former slaves were still working. And the politicians at that time wanted to exclude all African Americans from basic labor protections. And it was their compromise to exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers.
Got it. And so now that we talked about the kind of laws, I'm curious, as you think about the spaces that you occupy, you engage with workers in, how would you reimagine that work? Like what would be a better way for it to be organized?
Well, so definitely, if we think about what universal family care can look like, we think that the whole industry has to be transformed, where there's both equity and accessibility to care, as well as that foundation of care being valued and compensated, having to be good jobs. I mean, these are really critical jobs, and caring for some of the most important people in our lives. So we should be investing and valuing that work. And, it traditionally has been women's work. And so that's one of the reasons why it has been devalued. And women have been doing this work often not being paid. And that's some of the thoughts that have continued on. And we've seen it as we've been trying to pass domestic worker Bill of Rights across the country, of it not being seen as real work. But if you have ever cared for an elder, or if you've ever done focused childcare, I mean, it is definitely work, and it is very intense work. You have to have many different skills to manage that, especially as we have so many epidemics of like Alzheimer's and dementia and so many challenges now. It is very, very intense work, and it has the opportunity or the possibility of being an amazing job, an amazing opportunity. But it also is just, it's very difficult. And if you're a live-in worker, you almost get no sleep because you have to have your ears open. But the way that we're reimagining it is that universal care would mean that workers, one, would not have to be live-in, so that there would be, if there's someone who needs 24-hour care, you would actually have shifts, right? So you would have a care team that would come in. So no one has to give up all of their lives to be able to care for another person. So that's one thing. We want to do away with the live-in caregiving, and you don't have to worry about being live-in or wanting to be live-in because you couldn't afford housing otherwise. So we imagine that this work would really be compensated with benefits. Home care workers are providing a lot of basic fundamentals that help the health of those that they're caring for, but then they don't have health benefits for themselves. And we see it shouldn't be dependent just on individuals. We're really looking and building portable benefits so that no matter, because it can really shift in terms of how many clients you're caring for, or and it can end at any time. So how can we actually create portable benefits where the workers themselves are more in control of being able to pay themselves and not ask and depend on an agency to pay for it? So paid sick leave, paid family leave for home care workers and domestic workers, healthcare insurance, and retirement. And for that to happen, immigration reform also has to happen. So we see visas for home care as well as domestic workers, but citizenship for all, actually. So for all workers, and just another thing is that this industry or care should not be seen as just the responsibility of individual families. We have to see long-term care and care as an issue of our society jointly, and come up with the solutions so that everyone can have care. So this means investing in making sure that everyone, expanding benefits. Here in California, we have IHSS, in-home support services, that supports those who are very low income and having home care. But just because you're over that income line doesn't mean suddenly you can actually afford to hire a home care worker for as long as you actually need them. So middle class especially is really suffering under this. So we need a benefit along the lines of like Social Security that would actually provide for home care and child care as well, so that everyone who needs care can.
And this sounds quite expensive. How do you pay for all of that?
Well, there are different ways to actually pay for it. Seattle has a new benefit that they passed and that is rolling out. That is a payroll tax. But there could be a lot of different creative ways to actually pay. Payroll is okay, but it's also not as, it's a little bit flat for my taste. But there are a lot of different ways to pay for this. Hawaii actually has Kahuna Care that also is paid for. Some of the tourist taxes go to pay for long-term supports and services. And the thing is that providing home care individual home care can be a lot less expensive than having someone in a facility. So how we actually prioritize where subsidized money goes, one can go a long way to providing those needs. But, not having home care subsidized, not having care subsidized is actually costing us a lot as well, in terms of people not in the economy, not being able to work, and also, a lot of absenteeism in terms of employees because of lack of care. So this is like a basic infrastructure, like we invest in roads so that everything can function. Care is an invisible infrastructure that people don't recognize, but is actually a basic infrastructure of our families, of our society, that also needs to be invested in so that everything else can function.
So I don't know that we invest that much in roads, but I hear you. I hear you. But it sounds like what you're suggesting in part is shifting from managed care to home care. Is that fair? That's a big shift. So you're saying there's more, it costs more to do managed care in a facility as opposed to home care. So would you shift resources from that?
Well, most people who are surveyed would rather be in their homes versus in a facility. And there is a lot of research done that that it can be much more affordable to actually pay a home care worker to provide what's needed. Because not everyone needs 24-hour care also. They're like IHSS is able to keep a lot of people in their homes at a much more affordable rate than them being cared for 24 hours a day. So it increases the quality of life because they're able to stay in their communities with it's an assessed amount of care that helps them maintain in their own homes versus if they didn't have that care at all, they would need 24-hour care in a facility.
I see. And do you know other countries that do this really well? Are there other models?
There are other models. And so that's something that we've been starting to study because we are trying to create an expanded benefit here in California. So France, for example, does have a subsidized care system, both for child care and elder care. And there are other ways that they're we're also studying how they keep the jobs safe for domestic workers as well, where there's occupational health and safety. But so France is one of those, as well as a lot of the other European countries have more subsidized care. Yeah, so it's possible. We could do it here, and we're actually pushing for the home and community-based services part of the budget reconciliation bill. And that would, we're looking to expand who can actually access long-term care through Medicaid. And that will cost about $250 billion for the nation to be able to expand benefits and also increase workers' wages. But it's also assessed to really help local economies as well.
Okay, great. So if you were going to leave the audience with one thing about this topic, what would it be?
Now is the time to reimagine how our society works and functions. Before we thought that government couldn't invest at large levels or in different things, but actually we can. It's more about what we can actually execute. What can we actually do that will be effective? So we should think about, like, at this moment, especially when this is a time that we are really seeing the results of climate change as well. Like, how do we take this moment? We see that this is a time that we really are connected to each other. We, the health of everyone actually helps the health of everyone. And so how can we actually build back better from where we were before? And if we can build back better with a society that has more equity, where more people are thriving, that will create a stronger economy, will create much better richness of life for all of us.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. So our session next week will continue the topic of age. We'll talk about age in the workplace with Laura Carstensen, the founding director of the Stanford Center on Longevity, and Benji Baker, the executive director of the American Conservation Coalition. So thanks so much.